Who is really making your decisions today? You or something inside you that has learned to be afraid? And the more you think, the more confused you become. When the heart is clear, direction appears. Most people believe that deciding is a mental process. They think they need to analyze everything, calculate everything, predict everything. But watch what actually happens. The more you think, the more trapped you become. More fear appears, more doubts arise. The mind creates 1,000 scenarios, 1,000 consequences, 1,000 dangers, and suddenly something simple turns into a labyrinth. And if you keep listening until the end, you will understand why Rumi said, there is a place within you where every decision is already clear, and why almost no one manages to reach it. Rumi observed this centuries ago. He lived in the 13th century within the tradition of Sufism, the mystical path of Islam. And one of the deepest things he revealed is not a decision-making technique. It is something much simpler and at the same time much harder. He said there is a difference between the voice of the mind and the voice of the heart. The mind speaks loudly, it speaks quickly, it speaks with fear. The heart speaks softly, it speaks simply, it speaks calmly, but almost no one listens to the heart, because the mind never becomes silent. Rumi wrote something that has crossed centuries. Stop acting so small. You are the universe in ecstatic motion. This is not empty poetry. In Sufism, this sentence points to something direct. Within you, there is a part that already knows, not because it analyzed, but because it recognizes. Recognizing is different from thinking. When you see someone you love, you do not need to think in order to know that you love them. When you enter a place and feel that something is not right, you do not need to calculate to notice it. There is a kind of silent knowledge within you. The Sufis call this qalb, the spiritual heart. It is not the physical organ, it is the center of inner perception. And Rumi repeated something constantly that seems simple, but becomes devastating when you truly understand it. He said, what you seek is seeking you. Pause for a moment and feel that. If something inside you wants to follow a path, there is a reason. If something inside you feels peace when imagining a choice, there is a reason. But the mind steps in. The mind asks, what if it goes wrong? What if I lose? What if I look weak? What if others judge me? And suddenly you are no longer listening to the heart. You are listening to fear. And fear never knows how to decide, because fear always wants absolute safety. And absolute safety does not exist. That is why so many people spend years stuck. Relationships they do not know whether they should continue. Jobs they know they no longer want, but do not have the courage to leave. Spiritual paths they feel inside their chest, but are afraid to follow. And so they live like this, always in doubt, always waiting for the perfect sign, always waiting for total certainty. But Rumi never taught that life works that way. He taught something else. He said that truth appears when you stop fighting against it. There is a very well-known story in the Sufi tradition about this. A man went to a spiritual master and said, I cannot decide which path to follow. The master replied, that is not true. The man insisted, I truly do not know. The master then said something simple, you know, you just do not like the answer. This is one of the hardest things to accept. Very often you already know what the right decision is, but it requires courage, it requires detachment, it requires change, and the mind begins to negotiate. The mind tries to find a comfortable exit, but the heart does not negotiate. The heart recognizes, and when you ignore this for too long, something inside you begins to feel heavy. Perhaps you have already felt this, that strange sensation in your chest, as if something inside you were saying, this is not the path. But you continue, because it is easier, because it is safer, because everyone does it. And the more time passes, the farther you move away from yourself. Rumi spoke a lot about this. He said that The greatest human suffering is not making mistakes. It is living against your own truth. Because when you live against your truth, you feel it every day. In the body, in the mind, in the energy. Something always feels out of place. In Sufism, there is a concept called fitra. Fitra means original nature. It is the essence you were born with, before fear, before the expectations of others, before the masks. This essence knows. It recognizes what is true, but the mind creates layers, layers of fear, layers of conditioning, layers of approval, and these layers suffocate the inner voice. That is why Rumi did not teach only how to think better. He taught something far more radical: silence. He said something that became famous. Beyond ideas of right and wrong, there is a field. I will meet you there. This sentence is deeply misunderstood. It does not mean everything is the same. It means that deep truth is not born from the mind judging. It is born from the heart recognizing. When the mind stops fighting, something reveals itself. And this is where many people become uncomfortable, because it requires trust. Trust not in the world, trust in something within you. The Sufis call this tawakkul. Tawakkul means deep trust in reality. It is not passivity. It is not abandoning responsibility. It is acting without being controlled by fear. Rumi lived this. He was not just a poet. He was a spiritual master who guided people through this process of inner awakening. And one of the things he confronted most was exactly this: the mind's attachment to control. The mind wants to predict everything. It wants to guarantee everything. It wants to avoid any risk. But real life never works that way. Every true decision involves crossing into the unknown. And that is exactly where the heart reveals itself. When there are no guarantees, when there are no maps, when there is only inner honesty. There is a phrase attributed to Rumi that appears in many translations of his poems: when the soul is ready, the path appears. This does not mean magic. It means alignment. When you stop lying to yourself, something becomes clear. When you stop pretending you do not feel, something reveals itself. When you stop running away, something inside you begins to show direction. But here, there is a question that almost no one wants to face. If this inner voice exists, why do so many people never hear it? Why do so many people live decades without knowing what decision to make? Why do so many people remain trapped in paths that clearly are not theirs? Rumi had a direct answer for this, and that answer is not comfortable. It exposes something that may be happening inside you right now, and that almost no one has the courage to look at directly. Because according to the Sufi masters, there is a silent enemy that confuses all human decisions, and if you do not recognize this enemy, you may spend your entire life believing you are deciding, when in reality you are only reacting. And the question that now begins to arise is inevitable. Who is really making your decisions today? You, or something inside you that has learned to be afraid? In Sufism, Rumi and other masters spoke of something called nafs. The word nafs can be understood as the instinctive ego, that part of the mind that constantly tries to protect its own image, its comfort, and its safety. It is not an enemy in the sense of something evil, but it is a force with a single objective: to avoid any risk that threatens what you believe yourself to be. And here begins the problem that destroys so many human decisions. The nafs does not want truth. The nafs wants safety. And when a choice demands growth, change, or courage, the nafs immediately goes into action. It creates thoughts, arguments, justifications, and fears. It makes it seem as if you are being prudent, when in reality you are simply hiding. That is why so many people spend years saying they are thinking it through, when in truth they are only postponing their own truth. Observe something within yourself right now. Whenever a true decision appears, it comes accompanied by two different sensations. The first is a simple clarity. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is almost silent. It is like a calm recognition that says, "This is it." But soon after, something else appears. A storm of thoughts begins to arise. Fears, doubts, negative scenarios, and then the clarity disappears in the middle of the noise. Rumi observed exactly this phenomenon within the human being. He said that the heart recognizes quickly, but the mind begins to negotiate, and this negotiation is endless, because the mind can always imagine a new risk, a new problem, a new reason to wait a little longer. And so the person gradually moves farther and farther away from the first truth they felt. There is something brutally honest that Rumi reveals about this. He shows that the heart is not complicated. The heart is direct. The heart recognizes what is true in the same way you recognize the warmth of the sun on your face. You do not need to argue with the sun to know that it is there. You feel it. In the same way, there are decisions in life that are recognized even before they are explained. But the nafs begins to create resistance. It asks, what if this is a mistake? What if you regret it? What if others do not understand? And so what was simple becomes heavy. Rumi wrote a famous line that has crossed centuries. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? This question is not about a physical place. It is about decisions. Very often the door is already open before you. The path is already clear. But the mind continues staring at an imaginary lock. It keeps searching for absolute proof. It keeps waiting for guarantees that will never come. And so you remain still, even when the exit is already visible. In Sufism, there is a process called polishing the heart. The metaphor is simple and powerful. Imagine that the heart is like a mirror. When this mirror is clean, it reflects truth clearly. But when it is covered in dust, everything appears distorted. This dust is formed by fears, conditioning, the desire for approval, and illusions about who you need to be in order to be accepted. Each layer of dust makes it harder to recognize what is true. And then you begin to depend more and more on the mind to decide. But the mind, without the heart, is like a map without direction. Rumi constantly insisted on something that seems paradoxical. He said that to find clarity, you must stop searching for clarity in the mind. This seems strange at first, because we were trained to believe that thinking more solves everything. But look at your own experience. How many important decisions in your life truly emerged after 1,000 analyses? And how many times did the real decision appear first as a simple feeling, before any explanation? That feeling is the beginning of the inner voice, but it is fragile when the mind is full of noise. That is why the Sufis developed practices of inner silence. One of the most well-known is dhikr, which means remembrance. Dhikr is the practice of consciously repeating the name of God or sacred words, not as an empty ritual, but as a way of calming the mind. When the mind slows down, something begins to emerge naturally. It is not a literal voice. It is more like a clear perception. It is as if the path begins to illuminate from within. And many people report that in this state, decisions that once seemed impossible become simple. Rumi also spoke about the danger of searching for answers outside yourself. He said, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself." This sentence points to something fundamental. Most people try to resolve external confusion without looking at the internal confusion. They search for signs everywhere, opinions, advice, trends, social expectations. But the more external voices enter, the more distant the inner voice becomes. There is a specific moment when the true decision begins to appear. That moment happens when you stop asking, "What will protect me?" and begin asking, "What is true?" These two questions lead to completely different paths. The first is born from fear. The second is born from authenticity. And authenticity has a price. It demands that you accept the possibility of losing things that once seemed secure. Rumi did not romanticize this process. He knew that following the heart can be uncomfortable. It may require you to abandon old identities. It may require you to say no to paths other people expected you to follow. It may require you to face periods of uncertainty. But he also said something that changes everything when you truly understand it. He said that the pain of living against your truth is always greater than the pain of crossing the unknown. Perhaps you have already lived this. Perhaps you have felt that restlessness that appears when you are living something that does not match your essence. At first it is subtle, a light discomfort, an occasional thought, but over time it grows. The body begins to feel tired, the mind begins to feel confused, and the soul begins to ask for change. Many people try to ignore this for years, but truth has a strange way of continuing to call. Rumi often used the metaphor of inner music. He said that every human being carries a unique melody. This melody represents the truth of your existence. When you live aligned with this melody, there is a sense of flow. Things do not necessarily become easy, but they make sense. There is an inner coherence. But when you live trying to play someone else's music, something inside you begins to fall out of tune. And then, the most important question of all arises. If this melody exists within you, why do so many people spend their entire lives without hearing it clearly? The answer the Sufi masters give is simple and brutal. Because listening requires courage. Listening means accepting what appears. And very often what appears asks for transformation. It asks for detachment. It asks for a change of direction. Rumi spoke about this with a powerful image. He said that truth is like a river flowing within the heart. You can try to dam this river for a while. You can build walls. You can divert the flow. But the water always finds a path. And the more you try to block it, the more pressure accumulates, until one day something breaks. That is why some people experience moments of sudden awakening. After years of ignoring inner signs, something happens. A crisis, an encounter, a moment of deep silence, and suddenly clarity appears almost undeniably. Not because something new appeared, but because what was always there was finally heard. But there is something even deeper hidden within this teaching of Rumi. Something that completely changes the way you see decisions. Because according to the Sufis, the right decision does not arise only when you think better. It arises when you become someone different internally. And this opens a disturbing question. What if the problem was never a lack of answers? What if the real problem is that your mind is still not silent enough to recognize them? What if the problem was never the absence of answers? What if the real problem is that your mind is still not silent enough to recognize them? Pause for a moment and observe how decisions appear within you. I am not talking about small decisions like choosing what to eat or what clothes to wear. I am talking about the decisions that truly shape your life, relationships, professional paths, spiritual choices, changes of direction. These decisions almost never arise as a cold calculation. They appear first as an inner movement, a sensation, a silent attraction, or sometimes a discomfort that insists on remaining. The problem is that right after this first signal, the mind enters the scene. And when the mind enters, it does not want only to understand, it wants to control. It wants to transform something alive into something predictable. Rumi observed this movement with brutal clarity. He said that the mind is like a merchant who tries to negotiate with everything. It weighs, measures, compares, calculates. The merchant wants profit and safety. But the heart is not a merchant. The heart is a traveler. It moves toward what is true, even when the path is not completely visible. And this difference creates a deep conflict within many people. One part wants safety, another part wants authenticity. One part wants to avoid all risk, another part feels that staying where it is has already become the greater risk. This conflict is where so many decisions become trapped. There is a phrase attributed to Rumi that cuts through this theme like a blade. Go where you feel most alive. This sentence seems almost too simple, almost childish. But when you truly look at your life, it becomes disturbing. Because many people know exactly where they feel most alive, and still they do not go there. They remain where they feel safe, where they are accepted, where others understand them, and slowly they begin to move away from their own vitality. Life continues happening around them, but something inside grows quieter with each passing year. Rumi said that the human soul possesses a kind of inner compass. This compass does not point toward comfort, it points toward truth. Sometimes those two paths coincide, but often they do not. The compass points toward what makes sense for your essence, not toward what is easiest to explain to the world. And this is where courage begins to enter the story, because recognizing this direction is only the first step. The second step is accepting what that direction demands. In Sufism, there is a very important word called sadiq, which means deep sincerity. It is not merely being honest with others. It is being honest with yourself. It is looking inward and stopping the pretense that you do not feel what you feel. Many decisions remain confused because the person is still trying to convince themselves of something that deep down they already know is not true. The mind creates elegant arguments, rational explanations, social justifications. But the heart continues sending small signals, small discomforts, small callings. Perhaps you have already felt this at very specific moments, that sensation that something inside you is trying to say something, not like a clear sentence, but like a silent push. Sometimes it appears as unexpected enthusiasm for a path. Sometimes it appears as a deep resistance to something everyone says is normal. These signals are not madness. In Sufism, they are seen as movements of deeper consciousness trying to align your life with your essence. But there is a powerful obstacle in this process: the fear of losing safety, status, approval, stability. The nafs, that instinctive ego we mentioned earlier, immediately goes on alert. It begins painting dark scenarios. It turns every possibility into a threat. And then you begin to feel that perhaps it is better to remain where you are. Perhaps it is better to wait a little longer. Perhaps it is better not to disturb this now. And so more time passes. Rumi saw this happen constantly with the people around him, and he used a powerful image to describe that moment. He said many human beings live like birds that were born inside cages. The door of the cage may already be open, but the bird has become accustomed to that space. The sky feels too large, too uncertain, too frightening, so it remains there, even though it has wings. When you begin to look at your own life with honesty, something curious happens. Some decisions that once seemed impossible begin to reveal an unexpected simplicity, not because the consequences disappeared, but because you begin to see that the clarity was never in the mind. It was hidden behind fear. When fear is seen clearly, it loses part of its power. Rumi often reminded people that life is movement. Everything is changing all the time. The attempt to freeze everything into absolute safety is an illusion, and when you try to live inside that illusion, something within you begins to contract. The energy of life wants to flow. It wants to grow. It wants to explore. When that flow is blocked by constant fear, a strange feeling of stagnation appears. Perhaps you have already noticed people who seem alive in a different way. Not necessarily richer, not more famous, not more successful in the eyes of the world, but there is something in them that radiates presence, a kind of inner alignment. These people also face difficulties, but there is a sense of direction. They know why they are walking that path. Rumi suggested that this difference does not come from superior intelligence. It comes from inner listening. Some people learned to respect the signals of the heart. They do not wait for perfect guarantees. They observe the direction that feels true and begin to walk. And something interesting happens when this occurs. Small coincidences begin to appear. Unexpected meetings, opportunities that seem to arise at the right moment. The Sufis call this baraka, a kind of flow of blessing or alignment that appears when a person walks in harmony with their truth. This does not mean everything becomes easy. On the contrary, often the authentic path requires real effort. But there is a huge difference between effort that builds life and effort that merely maintains a mask. When you are aligned with your essence, even challenges seem to carry meaning. There is an inner coherence that sustains the movement. But here, a question arises that may be uncomfortable to face. If this inner clarity truly exists, why do so many people continue ignoring it, even when they begin to sense it? Why would someone feel the call of a path and still choose to remain still? The answer returns once again to the same point: the fear of transformation. Transformation means leaving old parts of yourself behind, old identities, old stories, old roles, and the ego often prefers to remain in a familiar prison rather than cross into an unknown freedom. Rumi spoke of this directly. He said that the soul desires expansion, but the ego desires stability. This conflict accompanies the human being in every great decision. When you begin to see this conflict clearly, something inside you changes. You begin to see your thoughts with more distance. Instead of believing every fear that appears, you begin to ask, is this really true? Or is it just my fear trying to keep everything the same? That simple question can open space for something new. And in that space, a different perception begins to arise. You realize that the right decision is not necessarily the one that promises the most immediate comfort. Often, it is the one that brings more truth, more coherence, more alignment with what you deeply feel. This perception changes the way you observe your choices. Rumi said that when the heart begins to awaken, it becomes like a magnet. It begins to attract experiences that correspond to its true nature. But for that to happen, first an act of courage is necessary, the act of recognizing what you truly feel, even if you still do not know exactly how to act upon it. And then a silent moment appears within human consciousness, a moment when the question stops being, which decision is safest, and becomes, which decision is most true to who I really am? That question changes everything, because it moves the center of decision from the mind to the heart. And when that shift happens, something very subtle begins to reveal itself inside you, a kind of signal that many people ignore for years, but that in truth has always been there, pointing the way. And the question that now begins to arise is almost inevitable. If that signal has always been inside you, why does it seem so difficult to recognize when the decision truly matters? If this signal has always been within you, why does it seem so difficult to recognize when the decision truly matters? The answer is simpler and more uncomfortable than most people imagine, because when a decision truly matters, it touches the deepest human fear, the fear of changing who you believe you are. Small decisions do not threaten your identity, but real decisions do this immediately. They question your routine, your certainties, your role in the world, and the ego goes into full alert. The mind begins to speak louder, faster, more urgently, and in all that noise, the silent signal of the heart becomes almost impossible to hear. Rumi often spoke about this difference between noise and truth. He said that truth rarely shouts, it whispers, and this seems like a problem in the modern world, because we are used to paying attention only to what is loud, urgent, and dramatic. But the direction of the soul works in the opposite way. It appears as an unexpected calm in the middle of confusion, sometimes as a sense of relief when you imagine a certain path, sometimes as a strange resistance when you try to follow a path that everyone says is the correct one. Observe this within yourself. When you think about a decision that truly feels right to you, something happens in the body. Your breathing changes, your shoulders relax. There is a sense of expansion, even if fear is present at the same time. This mixture of fear and expansion is one of the most curious signs of a true decision, because the soul recognizes the direction, but the ego is still frightened by the movement. The Sufi masters paid close attention to the body for this reason. They said the body often perceives truth before the mind does. The mind can be deceived by arguments, opinions, and social expectations, but the body reacts more directly. When something is deeply misaligned with your essence, the body begins to show signs: unexplained fatigue, a heaviness in the chest, a constant sense of tension. It is as if the entire organism is trying to warn you that something is not in harmony. Rumi used a powerful metaphor to explain this. He said that the human being is like a musical instrument. When the instrument is in tune, each note sounds clear. But when something is out of tune, even the correct notes produce discomfort. Life works in the same way. When your decisions are aligned with your essence, there is a sense of inner coherence. But when you insist on paths that are not yours, the music of your life begins to sound strange, and many people spend years trying to ignore that strange sound. They try to convince themselves that it is normal to live with that feeling of disconnection. After all, many people around them seem to live that way as well. But within the Sufi tradition, there is a very direct teaching. The human heart was not made to live disconnected from its own truth. When that happens, life loses intensity. The colors seem faded. Enthusiasm slowly disappears. Rumi said that the human soul possesses a natural capacity to recognize what brings it closer to its own origin. In Sufism, this origin is seen as the divine presence within every human being, not as something external, but as the spark of consciousness that gives life to everything. When you move closer to decisions that honor this spark, there is a sense of closeness to something greater. When you move away from it, a sense of emptiness appears. Perhaps you have felt this emptiness at some moment in your life. Everything seemed to work on the outside, but inside something felt out of place. This emptiness does not mean failure. Often, it is a sign that your soul is asking for realignment. It is like a silent alert saying that something needs to change. Rumi did not see this emptiness as a problem. He saw it as an invitation to return to listening to what had been ignored for a long time. Many people fear this moment because it forces them to look at past choices with honesty, but at the same time, it opens an enormous possibility for transformation. When someone begins to listen to these signals more carefully, something interesting happens. The confusion begins to decrease. Not because life becomes simpler, but because the person begins to trust their own inner perception more. They stop searching for constant approval from the outside, and this shift completely changes how decisions are made. Rumi said that the greatest prison of the human being is not external circumstances. It is the dependence on approval. As long as your decisions depend on the constant validation of others, inner clarity remains blocked, because you are not asking, what is true? You are asking, what will be accepted? And these two questions lead to completely different paths. There is a specific moment when inner clarity begins to gain strength. That moment happens when you decide to stop lying to yourself. It sounds simple, but it is extremely difficult, because all of us create small stories to justify choices that do not match our truth. These stories temporarily protect us from discomfort, but they also distance us from our real direction. Rumi said that sincerity with oneself is one of the greatest forms of spiritual courage. He taught that the Sufi path begins when a person stops pretending they do not feel what they feel, when they stop denying the inner call. And this moment can be disorienting because it often reveals paths that demand deep change. But there is something curious about this process. When a person finally admits to themselves what they truly feel, a huge part of the confusion disappears. The energy that was once used to sustain denial becomes free, and that energy begins to nourish clarity. Rumi often reminded people that inner truth does not need to be shouted to exist. It only needs to be recognized. Once recognized, it begins to influence your choices naturally. You begin to notice that certain decisions become impossible to ignore, not because someone told you to make them, but because continuing to avoid them becomes more painful. This point becomes a silent turning point in many lives. It is the moment when the question changes again. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" the person begins to ask, "What am I avoiding seeing?" That question opens inner doors that were once closed. And when those doors begin to open, something very strange happens. Decisions that once seemed enormous begin to feel inevitable, not because they are easy, but because you begin to feel that there is no longer another path that is truly honest. Rumi said that the human soul always seeks to return to its source, and every authentic decision is a small step in that direction. Every choice based on inner truth strengthens the connection with that source. Every choice based only on fear weakens that connection. This does not mean you will never feel fear. Fear always appears when something important is happening. But the difference lies in who is guiding the movement. If fear leads, life contracts. If truth leads, life expands. And here, a deeply intriguing point appears in Rumi's teachings, because according to him, when a person begins to follow this inner expansion, something very unexpected begins to happen, something that completely changes the way decisions appear in life. Because there comes a moment when you realize you are not the only one choosing the path. It begins to feel as if the path itself is choosing you. It begins to feel as if the path itself is choosing you. This phrase may sound strange at first, but within Sufism, it points to a very concrete experience that many people begin to notice when they start listening to the heart with greater honesty. At the beginning of life, almost all decisions seem to come only from the mind. You analyze, compare, calculate. Everything seems to depend entirely on your mental effort. But when someone begins aligning their choices with inner truth, something curious starts to happen. Life begins to respond differently. Small coincidences appear. People show up at the right moment. Information appears exactly when it is needed. The Sufis do not call this luck. They call it synchrony with the path. Rumi described it very simply. He said that when you take a true step toward what your soul recognizes, the universe takes several steps toward you. This is not magic in a superficial sense. It is alignment. When your inner energy stops fighting against its own direction, life begins to flow differently. And many people report that decisions that once seemed blocked suddenly begin to open unexpected doors. But there is an important detail here. This flow does not appear when someone is merely chasing superficial desires. It appears when the decision is connected to something deeper within the person. Rumi often said that the human heart has a direct connection with the mystery of existence. When someone begins to live in harmony with that connection, something within reality itself seems to respond. In Sufism, there is a word called tawfiq, which can be understood as divine assistance on the path. It does not mean a person becomes special or privileged. It means that when someone moves toward truth, certain forces of life begin to cooperate with that movement. Often this appears as unexpected opportunities or meaningful encounters. Perhaps you have experienced moments like this without realizing it. A casual meeting that changed your direction. An unexpected conversation that brought clarity. A book that appeared exactly when you needed an answer. These events often seem like coincidence, but within the Sufi tradition, they are seen as signs of alignment. Rumi deeply believed that life possesses an intelligence far greater than the human mind can understand. The human mind tries to organize everything into linear explanations, but reality is much more vast than that. When you try to control every detail of the future, you close yourself to that greater intelligence. But when you begin to walk with inner trust, something new becomes possible. This does not mean abandoning responsibility or acting impulsively. On the contrary, it means acting with presence and honesty. It means listening to the heart, observing the signals of life, and walking with awareness. This balance between inner listening and action in the world is one of the pillars of the Sufi path. Rumi often reminded people that the spiritual path is not an escape from life. It is a deeper way of living within it. Making authentic decisions does not mean escaping human responsibilities. It means bringing more truth into them. When someone lives this way, even simple tasks gain meaning, but something usually happens before this synchrony begins to appear, something many people avoid facing. Before the path begins to respond, there is often a period of uncertainty, a period when you must act without clear guarantees. This moment is extremely challenging because the mind wants proof before moving. Rumi spoke about this using the image of crossing a desert. At the beginning of the crossing, you can still see the place you came from. The past is still visible, but the destination has not yet appeared clearly on the horizon. This space between the known and the new is where many people give up. They turn back because the unknown feels too frightening. But the Sufis teach that this desert is an essential part of transformation. It is in the desert that the ego loses strength. It is in the desert that you begin to trust something beyond mental control. And it is in this space that the heart becomes more sensitive to the signals of life. Rumi described this in many of his poems. He spoke of the necessity of passing through moments of emptiness and uncertainty so that something new can be born. Without this process, a person continues living only within the old structures of the mind. True change rarely happens inside the comfort zone. When someone accepts crossing this space of transformation, something curious begins to occur. The person starts to realize that many things that once seemed fundamental were only mental habits. Old fears begin to lose their intensity. Social expectations begin to seem less important. At this point, the relationship with decisions changes completely. Instead of asking, "How can I avoid any mistake?" the person begins to ask, "How can I live with more truth?" This shift in the question changes the quality of decisions. A decision stops being merely a calculation. It becomes an expression of one's own essence. Rumi believed that every human being carries a unique mission within existence, not necessarily a grand mission in the social sense, but a unique way of expressing life. When someone begins to recognize this inner mission, decisions start to organize themselves around it. But this mission rarely appears as a clear idea at the beginning. It reveals itself gradually through the choices a person makes. Each true decision brings a person closer to their own nature. Each decision based only on fear creates more distance. That is why Rumi insisted so strongly on the importance of listening to the heart with honesty. He knew that clarity does not appear all at once. It appears in layers, first as a small intuition, then as a stronger inner knowing, and finally as a quiet conviction. When this conviction appears, something inside you changes deeply. The decision no longer feels like an obligation. It becomes almost inevitable. You realize that following that path is not just one possible choice. It is the only choice that truly makes sense for who you really are. And at this point, many people begin to notice something surprising. The life that once seemed full of confusion begins to gain direction. Decisions stop being endless labyrinths. They become natural steps along a path that gradually reveals itself. But there is a fascinating detail that Rumi also mentioned. Even when someone begins to live aligned with their truth, decisions do not disappear. What changes is how they appear. They stop arising as paralyzing doubts and begin to appear as invitations to grow. And this raises a very profound question that you may never have considered before. What if the true purpose of the decisions in your life was never simply to choose between options? What if every decision was always, in fact, an invitation for you to become who you truly are? What if every decision has always been, in truth, an invitation for you to become who you really are? Pause for a moment and feel the weight of that idea. Perhaps you have spent years believing that decisions are simply practical choices in life. Choosing paths, choosing people, choosing opportunities. But within the deeper vision of Sufism, every decision carries a far greater role. Every decision reveals something about who you are becoming, not only about what you do in the world, but about who you are allowing yourself to be within. And this completely changes the way you see your doubts. Because when a decision appears before you, it almost always brings two opposing forces. One force pulls you toward the familiar, toward what has already been tested, approved, accepted. The other force pulls you toward something that does not yet have a clear shape, something that feels alive but uncertain. The problem is that most people have been trained to trust only the first force. The familiar feels safe, the new feels dangerous. But Rumi said something that completely challenges this logic. He said that what truly belongs to you often appears first as something unknown, not because it is foreign to your essence, but because you have not yet had the courage to live it fully. There is a part of your life that you already know well. It is the part shaped by expectations, by culture, by the rules of the environment where you grew up. But there is another part that you may not have explored yet. That unknown part is where much of your truth lives, and every time an important decision arises, these two parts begin to speak within you. The known part says, "Stay where you are, it is safe here." The unknown part says, "There is more life on the other side." And this is where many people become paralyzed. Rumi said that the human being lives between two worlds, a world made of habits and a world made of possibilities. The first is comfortable because it is familiar. The second is frightening because it has not yet been experienced. But transformation always happens when someone has the courage to cross that boundary. There is a silent moment within human consciousness when something begins to change. It is when you realize that continuing to live only within the known no longer brings the same feeling of life. Something inside you begins to ask for more space, more truth, more authenticity, and that feeling does not disappear easily. At first it appears as a light restlessness, a question that arises from time to time. Then it begins to appear more often. You begin to notice that certain things that once seemed sufficient no longer satisfy you in the same way. This is one of the first signs that something inside you is awakening. Rumi saw this awakening as a call of the soul, not a dramatic or supernatural call, but a natural movement of human consciousness seeking expansion. When this call appears, decisions begin to carry a different weight. They stop being merely external choices and become responses to something internal. Perhaps you have already noticed this in specific moments of your life. That feeling that a seemingly simple choice carries a much deeper meaning, as if something inside you was saying that this moment matters more than it appears. This sensation does not come from logic. It comes from the depth of human experience. Rumi believed that every human being carries within themselves a unique potential for expression, something that only that person can bring into the world. But this potential does not appear automatically. It reveals itself through the decisions you have the courage to make throughout your life. Every decision based on inner truth strengthens that potential. Every decision based only on fear weakens that connection, and over time this difference begins to become visible in the way a person lives. Some people seem increasingly alive, present, and connected to their essence. Others seem increasingly trapped in routines that no longer make sense. Rumi observed this with great attention. He said that the human soul has a natural tendency to grow, just as a plant grows toward the light. But if the plant is trapped inside a closed environment, it may spend a long time without realizing that there is a sun outside. The important decisions in life are like small openings in that closed environment. Each one allows a little more light to enter your consciousness. But for that to happen, you must be willing to look at that light, even if it reveals parts of your life that need to change. Many people avoid this moment because it demands radical honesty. Honesty about what they truly desire, honesty about what they truly feel, honesty about what no longer corresponds to their own truth. This honesty may be uncomfortable at first, but it is also deeply liberating. Rumi said that inner truth does not need to be created. It already exists. What needs to be removed are the layers of fear, conditioning, and expectation that hide it. When these layers begin to fall away, clarity appears almost naturally. At this point, something very interesting happens with decisions. They stop feeling like an internal battlefield. Instead of fighting against yourself, You begin to feel a more coherent direction, not because all doubts disappear, but because something deeper begins to guide the movement. This inner guidance does not function like a detailed manual. It works more like a feeling of alignment, a kind of peace that appears when you approach a true path. Even if that path still contains challenges, it carries a sense of authenticity. And when someone begins to live with this kind of alignment, something changes in the way the world responds. Relationships begin to reorganize. Opportunities begin to reflect the person's truth more clearly. Even the energy with which they move through life transforms. Rumi saw this as a process of remembrance. He said that the human being is constantly trying to remember who they truly are. Every true decision is a step in that remembrance. Every moment of courage brings you closer to your own essence. But there is an extremely important point in this process that many people do not notice at the beginning. Following your inner truth does not mean the path will always be comfortable. Often it requires passing through phases of doubt, change, and intense growth. And it is exactly in this moment that something very deep happens within human consciousness. Because when you continue walking even without complete guarantees, a new kind of trust begins to emerge. And this trust raises a powerful question that begins to echo within you. If your soul has always known the direction, how many decisions in your life have you made only to avoid listening to that truth? Perhaps something is happening inside you right now as you hear all this. Perhaps a memory has appeared. Perhaps an old decision is returning to your mind. Perhaps there is something you have been avoiding looking at directly for a long time. And this is not a coincidence. When someone comes into contact with deep truths, the mind begins to bring to the surface what was hidden, not to torment you, but to reveal something that has been waiting to be seen. Many people spend years trying to ignore certain inner callings. They continue living, working, relating, fulfilling roles. On the outside, everything seems to function, but inside there is a constant feeling that something is not fully aligned. This feeling is not weakness. It is consciousness trying to awaken. Rumi spoke about this moment as the beginning of a silent change. He said that the awakening of the soul rarely begins with dramatic events. Most of the time it begins with a simple question that repeats within you. Is this really who I am? That question may seem small, but it has the power to open enormous doors within consciousness. When this question begins to appear frequently, life stops feeling automatic. You begin to observe your decisions more carefully. Paths that once seemed obvious begin to feel questionable, and paths that once seemed impossible begin to feel strangely attractive. This happens because something inside you begins to recover its original sensitivity. Before all the layers of conditioning, expectations, and fear, the human being has a natural capacity to recognize what is true. That capacity never disappears completely. It only becomes muffled. Rumi compared this process to cleaning an old mirror. For years, the mirror may remain covered in dust. You look at it and barely see any reflection. But when you begin cleaning it slowly, something curious happens. The reflection was always there. It did not need to be created. It only needed to be revealed. The same happens with clarity and decisions. The answer is often already within you, but it remains hidden behind the noise of the mind. When that noise diminishes, the answer begins to appear in a surprisingly simple way. Perhaps now you are beginning to realize something that almost no one ever explained to you about decisions. The right decision rarely appears as a perfect thought. It appears as a silent truth within you. The problem was never the lack of answers. The problem was always the noise of the mind. Rumi did not teach people to think more. He taught people to listen more deeply. Because when the mind finally slows down, something very curious happens. Clarity appears, and perhaps at this moment you are realizing something about your own life. That decision you have been avoiding, perhaps you already know the answer. Perhaps it is only waiting for a moment of courage. If this message helped you see something within yourself that was previously hidden, then do two simple things now. First, subscribe to the channel, because here we explore the deep teachings of Rumi and Sufism in a direct and transformative way. Second, leave a comment with the word clarity if you feel that something inside you began to awaken while listening to this. And now I want to ask you a silent question. The decision you are avoiding, is it really confusion? Or is it simply fear of accepting the truth that your heart has already recognized?